Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Build an E-commerce Store with a Spring Boot Backend. Episode 4 is on user registration. A quick intro today, just our objectives. So we've got 3 objectives. The first one is to add an endpoint for user registration on our REST API. Secondly, we're going to add validation to the registration to ensure that we have valid credentials and valid registration details being passed. And finally, we're going to test the registration by putting in some data and making sure that it goes through to the database. So let's jump straight into it. Okay, so here we are back in our development environment again. So first things first, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new package called API. And this is where we're going to have all of our API interaction happen. So we're going to have our REST controllers, WebSocket going in the future. We're also going to have the model of our API. Now that's something we need to differentiate because you have the model of your database, but you also have a model of your API because your API isn't necessarily always going to be the same data that your database returns. So let's make another package under our API called model as well, so that we differentiate between our data model and our API model. We're going to create a new Java class, and this is going to be called registration body. And this is just going to be a very simple class. We're going to have a private string username, private string email, private string password, private string first name, and private string last name. I'm just going to confirm my user class here. We can see that we have we have a username, a password, an email address, a first name, and a last name. So that's all we need to build up our first registration body. All right. So this is the outline of the data that we're expecting to receive from the front end. So we're going to have another package here. I'm going to remove the model bit, and we're going to call this package API.controller. And then inside there, we're going to have another one called called auth to separate these authentication-based ones. Okay, so now we've got our auth package, we're going to now type in a new class called authentication controller. So to create this into a REST controller, we're going to have @controller and @mapping, I believe is have I got the wrong one? Nope, I have got the wrong one. What is it called again? It's request mapping. Sorry, there we go. So request mapping, we're going to say that this is going to be mapped as /auth from our website. So when we go to our domain, we'll have blah.com/auth, and then it will come into this class. And we're then going to create a new method, and we're going to call this method. What's the return type of our method? Well, we're going to register a user, so the return type would be a Boolean, whether we are true or false normally. But when we're talking about REST APIs, it's kind of, you don't return true or false into it. You kind of actually return some data of some kind, and you use HTTP codes to specify if there's an error. So what your best bet is actually we're going to just return nothing for now, and we're going to call this method register user. Okay, and we'll leave it blank at the moment. And then we're going to have and this is a post mapping because we're posting data. And the mapping for this is going to be /register. So if we take that and start it up, and we're going to open up Postman again from earlier. And as it starts up in the background, we can see it starting up.
That's complete initialization. So where we had our get method before, so we're going to change this to post. It's got close that. I need to upgrade it. HTTP localhost 8080, and we're going to change this from test to be /auth/register. We hit send. You can see I get status 200, which means that it went through and it came back all okay, which is brilliant news. Because if there was a problem, so if I had put the wrong path, you can see if I send that now, 404 not found, because registry doesn't exist. So we can send the data back and forth, which is brilliant. So we now need to say we want the registration body, which is our information for registration, to be sent to us. So registration, registration, let's see if I can spell correctly, registration body, and that's what we're going to get, and we're going to say that's from @request body to say that that's what the payload is, and that's how we know that that's what we're receiving. So if we now restart this, we'll notice that if we try and send this registration thing again, it's now saying that's bad request because the request body is missing. So let's build up this body then, shall we? We're going to have a raw and set it to JSON. We're just going to empty an empty JSON object and we're going to send it. As you can see, it's saying status OK. Validation, like we said in the objectives, that comes second. First, let's focus on the registration bit. So we've got username is test number 1, and then password 1, and we've got email is test@tester.com. We've got first name is Dave, and last name is Tester. Okay, so this is our registration body. We've just built that as JSON because we know that this is how it would look. Because if you look at the registration body, these are the variable names. So we match those as the keys, and we can put whatever we want as the body, as long as it's the same type, which is a string. So if we try and send that now, we're still getting status 200, which is good. An example of something that would be bad is if we put here an example of something else. We're still okay, which is bad because this means this is being ignored. Now, you can argue it's good or bad. Me personally, I don't really mind. If they send data that we don't need, then that's the front end's problem. We can send this, and we know that that's okay. So we now have a registered body, and to further prove that we have our registered body, we could take the registered body and print the temporarily make the username public just to get it out. Well, in fact, actually, let's not do that. We're going to come in here. We're going to add the getters for all of these because these all will need to be fetched out at some point, one point or another. So we're going to get out the username and dump that into the console. So we can quickly refresh that. As we see it reload in the background, our username is test-1, remember? So if we hit send, you can see in our console test-1 has been printed out. So that means that we have the post mapping correctly going through. So now that we have our registration body, we have to build the registration, the user from that, right? So we've got our API package, we've got our model package. Let's create a new package here. Okay, sorry about that. Right, yes, so we want to come in here and we want to create a new package to facilitate the API, the MVC structure, where API is our V, model is our model, the M, and the C is controller. In our case, we're going to call that service. So it's this idea of microservicing, but you don't actually have to have those as physical applications. They can be within your application. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new class called user service, and we're going to utilize Spring and call that a component. Actually, in fact, we're going to call it a service because that's what it is. Move that component and import there. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a public local user put local user, which is our user that we created in the last episode. And we're going to call register user. And that's going to take the registration body in. And what that does, so the whole point of this is, say that, for example, we had another system that also needs to communicate with this, but they didn't want to use the REST API, they wanted to use something else. Or we had another part of the system that we wanted to auto-register. For example, let's say there was an onboarding process where you had existing user information. You wanted to onboard it via files, for example. Well, then you can do this without having to have the REST API, because you've just got to write another bit of code that knows to interact with this user service. So here we have the register user section, method, sorry. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new local user. So we go local user equals new local user. We go user.set email will be registration body.get email. User.set first name will be registration body set get first name, and so on and so on. I'm just going to quickly do these here. Last name, user.set username is username. So we've got our username, and then you see we've got all of these bits, but there's one left, which is our password. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a to-do encrypt passwords. But for now, just because this section of the tutorial, we're not going to focus on the encryption, because that's the next, I think it's either the next one or the one after that we're going to focus on the encryption. For now, we're just going to do this because the encryption comes along with a dependency we're going to use. So we've got our registration body to get the password, and we're going to set that password. Now that's going to set it in plain text, but obviously when we go to encryption, it's going to encrypt it before it's set. So that's why we got our to do here, all right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to then before we just do that, we now need to understand the concept of how to write and read data from the database. So under our model, we're going to create a new package called DAO. We're going to create a new interface called local user DAO. Okay, or you could call it repository if that's your kind of terminology. And what we're going to do is we're going to implement, extends, and then we're going to call it a CRUD repository of type local user, and we have longs as the identifier. Import that. So what this will do is it will allow us to have the local user DAO, which is our own little repository, repository data access object for the local users. It's going to create a CRUD repository based on the Spring JPA framework. It's going to use local user as the data object that we're saving and writing, etc. And we've got long as the identifier. So what this allows us to do now is with our JPA buddy, we can see this allows us to create things, queries and updates, etc. But the stuff that we need is already implemented thanks to this CRUD repository, because if you go into CRUD repository, that was a control and click, by the way, there. You can see that it has save, for example, save all, find by ID, find all these really helpful methods have already been laid out for you. So now in our user service, all we have to do is come here and go private local user DAO, and then create it as a thing. And if you create a constructor, which I'm going to have the code IntelliJ do for me here. So when Spring loads this user service, it's going to create the local user DAO and inject it into this method for us. So now we come down here, we can go local user DAO dot save our user record here, and if we look at the Java or the method stuff for this, it sends back the object that we've just saved. So we have local user then becomes that. All right. So now that we've saved it, we now write it back to our user variable, the new version that would have an ID inside of it.
and then we can then return the user. Now, alternatively, if you want something a bit more clean looking or shorter, you can just return directly off of that. It's up to you. Now, obviously, the thing that you've got to make sure about is exception handling, but we're going to get that. We'll get into that at a later date. So we've got our register user method all written up now. So let's go back to our registration body, our authentication controller. And we're going to do the same with our DAO, the same as what we did with our DAO, and create our user service as a variable in here. And we're going to make it as a constructor. I'm not sure why my constructors keep getting declared at the top there. But there we go. We've got our user service being injected thanks to Spring. So what we can now do is we can go user service dot register user registration body, and that will register the user for us straight away off the bat. So now if we refresh this, we will see it load up. It should look all okay, and we'll come into our Postman here, and we're going to just hit send. Status 200, that's good news. If we come into SQL Server, we're going to go into tables, and we're going to go to local user, right click, select top 1000 rows. And as you can see here, we've got ID1 is test@test.com, Dave tester, and password 1, test1. So it's brilliant. That means that we now have our method writing the data away. That's really good. Okay, so now we've got a complication though, because what if I now go in here and hit send again? I got one of these nasty errors. You see, I could not execute statement because there's constraint. And if we look in our log here, it gives us a bit of an easier way to look at it. But unique constraint, this is a annoyingly encrypted unique constraint key. But you can see here, cannot insert duplicate key local user, and the duplicate key is the email address. So that means that before we do our registration, we actually have to check that these unique fields haven't already been written. So what we can do is before we use this, we're going to create another package just called exception, and we're going to create a new exception here just called user already exists exception. And that extends exception, but we're not actually going to kind of do anything in here. Oh, it looks like I've spelt exists wrong. Let's quickly refactor that, rename exists exception. But yeah, we're not going to create any code in here because we just need it as almost really as a flag for when it's coming back. So here we can see we're registering the user, and we're actually going to say that this now throws user already exists exception. And up front, what we're going to do is we're going to go, we've got our local user DAO. We're going to go find, but you see here we can only find by ID, but ID is not something that we're trying to register here. We need to check if the email and if the username already exists. You know, these two. Well, there's a way to add that. So if we go in our local user DAO and come in here, we're going to add some new stubs. But I'm going to use JPA Buddy for this because it's easier doing that than remembering it off the top of your head. So we need to find an instance, and it's going to be an optional because we don't know if it exists or not. We're hoping it doesn't. And we're going to look for where the username is whatever we give it. Okay, and we're going to actually say ignore case because we want usernames with any cases to match. Okay, so we're going to put that in, and as you can see, that generates a little method stub here. So optional local user find by username ignore case username, and we're going to do that just one more time, but this time we're going to do it for the email address. Again, ignore case. So now we have our two extra methods. We can come back to our user service, and we can go local user DAO find
by email address, registration.get email, and then we can say at the front of this, if dot is present. So if we search for the email in the users table and it is present, then we want to throw new user already exists exception. Okay, and then what we can do is we can just add this. So and local user DAO find by username registration body.get username, and we can just drop that down to another line to make it a bit more presentable. Is present, and actually that should be an or. So if our email address is present or our username is present, then we throw this exception back. Now if we come back to authentication controller, you can see here we actually have registration user being an error because we're not handling our exception. So let's handle that exception, shall we? So what we've got here is we've got our exception, and we're not going to throw a new runtime exception. What we're going to do is we're going to actually make this return a thing called response body. And response body allows us to edit the HTTP response that's being sent back. So we're going to return in here, return response body dot okay. Response. Oh, sorry, it's response entity. That's my bad. Right, so response entity, and we're response entity okay dot build, and that means that when we register, if we don't fail this line here, we're going to return response entity dot okay, which is the 200 command, and build that entity and send it out. Otherwise, we're going to return response entity dot status and HTTP status code dot dot, and then there's one called conflict, and then we're going to build that and send it. So now if we restart our application here, we can see it building in the background, and we should see initialization come up. And if we try to send this now, we can see we get the return code of 409 conflict. If we come in our database, we can make sure that a second one hasn't randomly appeared. So now let's test that. Before it was complaining about the email, so clearly the email was checked first. So let's check for test2 and send that again. We still have our conflict because our username needs to be updated. So we change that, and there we go, status 200. Okay, if we refresh this, we've got ID 3, test 2, Dave, tester, password 1, test 2. And again, if we try to save that once more, you see our conflict reappears. So that means that now we're processing the username and the email to make sure that we don't get duplicates in our database. Because ultimately, you want to prevent those things from happening before SQL Server even hears about them, because that will increase your performance, hopefully. So that's how we do that. Now, the next part we want to do is we want to validate the actual data inside of that, the data inside of that response body, and make sure it's valid. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our friendly starter.spring.io. What have I done wrong? Starter.spring.io. Or is it start? Got it. I'm doing really well here today. So Maven and number 3 again. We're going to go into dependencies. I'm going to go to validation. I'm going to get the dependency information for this validation module. So go explore, come into our POM. As you can see here, we've got nothing else particularly different. It's just this dependency here. So let's copy that and go into our POM and our project. Drop that in here. As you can see, Spring Boot starter validation. Go let Maven pick up those new bits and pieces. And what it's going to allow us to do is hopefully, now this is where it may not work because I can't remember which way around it is. Hopefully that means that we can just do @valid here. And what this @valid does is whenever Spring sees this @valid, it verifies that this parameter goes against the validation. If we go into registration body, what we can do is above email, we can type in @email. Now let's refresh this, and fingers crossed, if I have remembered correctly, because I may not have, fingers crossed, we should receive an error message if we come in here. We're going to change our email address to have no email @ symbol, and we're going to send that, and it would appear that it's going through. So I haven't remembered correctly in this case. So I believe then in that case you actually have to do it on a different section. I think it's inside the controller level you have to do it. Valid. And restart it. And is it loaded? Yep. So if we restart again. Here we go. You can see now that we have our error message now that I was expecting. So we got an error 400 request, bad request. And if we go in the log doesn't show it, but you can see here, if I try and expand this out so it's a bit more clear, you can see here we've got validation failed for argument 0 in public, blah, 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 blah. Register user, registration body, error in object registration body on field email, rejected value test2 codes, email, blah, blah, blah. So basically it's saying here, oh, this isn't a real email address. You shouldn't be sending me this. So let's make it a real email address and try and submit again and see what happens. So it's all okay this time. We come in here, we've got test4@tester.com. Brilliant. So this is an example of what the validation module in Spring Boot does, which is really handy. You can put valid at front of it, and if you use the annotations of the various validation elements, it will validate inside that data model as it constructs it. Now, if you wanted to do the validation inside, say, for example, the user service area, I believe there is something called validator inside here, this one I believe. And what you can do is obviously add that to our constructor. Oh, whoops. Add to constructor. There we go. And then what you do is you do validator.validate registration body, and then you give it an errors thing, which you know what, I cannot remember. New errors maybe. Oh, my memory is being tested quite a lot today. I think it's there's a way of implementing it, but I'm not going to go into that because that's not what we're aiming for today. So I'm going to just remove that from this class. But yeah, so we're going to do it at the controller level. You might want to do validations on field sizes, etc. at a code level as opposed to a Spring level. Now, obviously, that would be the way you would try and use the validator instance from Spring to do that. However, I'm not off the top of my head 100% sure, so you'd have to do some research on that. But the valid bit in here does work. So let's go to our registration body and let's start specifying some of the things that we need in here. So we can start off straight away by saying not null on all of these. Okay, because we know that every last one of these fields are not allowed to be null in this case. Oops. All right, so none of these are allowed to be null. We can also add on and say that the username can be not blank. It's not blank. And again, the same with all the others as well, to be fair. None of them are supposed to be blank. And then what we can do is we can also use @min and @max. So this is the minimum amount of characters that the username should be. So let's say, for example, 3, and @max it should be when we created our username before, it was 255. So we can do that for the password. Password should be a minimum of, say, 6 in our implementation, a maximum of 32 characters. And then also what you can do is you can add patterns. So you can do @pattern, and then you can specify a regex in here. So for example, let's go simple password regex. So in here, they've got a minimum of 8 characters, at least 1 letter and 1 number. Minimum of 8 characters, at least 1 letter, 1 number, 1 special character. 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 number special. I mean, we don't really want special characters. Let's go for this one. I mean, the regex, again, it's going to be different for you for what you need. So, go and find the one that you need. But for us, we're just going to go with this one. Minimum of 8 characters. We can change that to 6, though. At least 1 letter and 1 number. So we can come in here, drop this in here, and change that to 6. Sorry. Legal escape characters for string literal. Is it because of these, I think? Oh, this is where my memory is being tested again. Oh, it's because you actually have to specify it. Yeah. So regex equals this. Oh, right, yeah, because it is. Because you have to do the double backslashes on this. There we go. Right, so as you can see, we've got pattern regex, and this is our regex saying that we need to have a letter, at least 1 letter and at least 1 number with 6 length. So you can see here we've got that set up for the password. Our first name and our last name will just leave as not being blank and not being null. The same with our email. We've got this @email, which is pretty handy. Spring supplies us with a criteria for checking emails. And username, we're just going to go for a minimum of 3, a maximum of 255. So now if we restart our application, we're almost at the end of the episode because we've mostly completed everything it is that we set out to do. So if we try and save this record that we have now, we have an error. And it's saying that the field username, username rejected value, default message must be greater than or equal to 3. I wonder if it's because the min-max is only for integers. I thought it was for strings as well. Yes, it's only for integers. Right, okay, so let's go back. So this min-max is actually not correct. So what we can do is let's just quickly have a Google. So spring validation annotation min character length. As you can see here, size is what we're looking for. Size min 2 and size max 200. So let's go for that. So go here, we go size max equals 32, min equals 6. So we can change that. That's for the password. If we bring this same back up here, min equals 3, max equals 255. I mean, 255 is already massive, but we're going to just stick with that for now. I mean, again, your business case for you is going to differ. So let's now refresh our application. As you can see today, we're both learning together. So here we are, initialized, and if we try and send it to now, we get 200, and we come in here, we see number 5 has been created, which is brilliant. So that means that now we just need to test our validation. So we made sure that last name is not null. And as you can see here, actually, I'm just going to change this to 6 so that we don't have conflicts. You see, last name was rejected because it was null. If we change it to just be blank and send it again, last name was rejected. So change that back. Something else we checked was, does this have a number in it? So try and send that. Password was rejected because it doesn't have the correct format. If we change this to be only numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, we've got password was rejected. Change this to just pass1. There we go. Password was rejected again because of the size. So we can change that back to what? It's just password1. And the username also, if we just try and put it as TE, username was rejected. So we change that back to 6 and send it, and there we go. So there we go. We had our 3 objectives of the day. The first one was to expose an endpoint to allow you to register users. The second one was to validate the responses, which we have done using the Spring validation framework, as well as our own little validation to check that the user didn't already exist. And finally, we did our testing. We tested all the end cases for the different validations. So again, thank you very much for watching. The next episode, we're going to be focusing on adding an ability to log in. We'll also go over the encryption of passwords. And then following that, we'll go into Spring security to go over how we process and authenticate requests. So again, thank you very much for watching. Remember that there is a playlist on my channel, so you can go through all these videos at once. And feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.